we had a big executive, and they ran the place. And you can imagine if you go in there, especially if you're a woman, and then you want to change them or want them to do something different. Like, at least if you have another woman or another like-minded person, you've got somebody to second your motions. I couldn't even lots of times get stuff on the floor, because how do I get it there if I don't have anybody to, will second it for you? And so then I was off for a year, and then I got back on, and I never was off till I went to work for CUPE. So that was many, many years. But and it was funny too. It was right around that time that the city was doing kind of like well, in those days, I guess they were called classification reviews. And out of our whole bargaining unit, which was around 1,500 or 1,600, the only people who were either frozen or got a decrease were the clerical workers. And everybody else got a raise. And that really ticked me off. Not that I didn't, when you go into those kinds of things, you take your luck, you take your chances. But it seemed to me awfully funny that the jobs that were traditionally and prominently women were the ones that took the big, because of course they didn't want to fight for us. And the other side of that is that the women didn't come to union meetings. In those years, the old myth was if you worked for the city, like you were there for life. So, and of course they were used to, if you will, men kind of unions, or male-dominated unions, in my view. And they didn't have any understanding for, first of all, public sector workers, and secondly, they didn't have any understanding of women workers. In those early years, it was very difficult because it was really hard to make them understand. And you see, the other part of it was very hard to get women involved, because as in those days, and I guess it's the same these days, although I think it's somewhat different, but I mean, like, for example, myself, I had a little girl. So if they wanted to have a meeting after work, I couldn't go to a meeting after work. If they had a meeting after supper, yes, I could go, because I could go home, get my child's supper and looked after, and get somebody to look after her. Or I was quite lucky, we lived with my mom and dad, so my mom would look after. But I was the primary caregiver for her, so I couldn't do that. Same as like union meetings. Union meetings, to me, 2 hours should have been long enough, and they'd go on, and then another thing too, we used to, they'd go to the bar afterwards.
Sure.
Now, I had nothing to do, nothing against drinking, but I couldn't do that, because if I went home, looked after my kid, went to the union meeting, and by the time I went home again, I had to wash diapers and do bottles and stuff. I hadn't, those 2 hours they sat in the bar, I couldn't do that because I was home working.
That's often where the real business is decided.
And I was just going to say, that's where they make the decisions. Lots of times, that's where they make the decisions. And you couldn't be part of that, or chose not to. Other than that, like I always used to tell them, don't make your decisions in the bar, because you won't find me there. That's not fair to the people who don't. First of all, it's not fair to the people who don't drink, and it's not fair to the people who don't want to do that. And in those days, sit in smoky bars. It's not quite so bad nowadays. I don't know, I don't go to bars, but if they're not, I gather they're not as smoky. So that was a difficult thing. It's the same as going to conventions and those kinds of things where decisions are made on behalf of the organization. It was difficult in those years to get women to go, because of course they somehow had to provide for childcare while they were away. Now it's good. They have childcare at conventions, and although it's still difficult because you still got the evenings or those hours, you can't, you have nobody to look after your child, but at least they've made a major stab. And I tell you, the interesting part about it is, when they started to get it was when we started to have more single men, or men that were single parents. And then they seemed to get it when it was them. But when women complained about it, it was just your job. And, the same old stuff that's been going on for years and years.